experimental approach like other behaviorists, but he differs from other behaviorists like Skinner, even Pavlov, who's actually associations but then has implications for behaviorism, and other associationists and behaviorists, because his approach is what is called hypothetico-deductive approach. Rather than being an inductive theory, his theory is a deductive theory. ये हमने पहले किया था यूनिट 1 में, अगर आपको याद हो, ठीक है। और इसमें बेसिकली फर्क क्या है, अब आप चाहे पावलोव देख लीजिए या स्किनर देख लीजिए या थॉर्नडाइक देख लीजिए, इन लोगों ने एक्सपेरिमेंट्स किए, एक्सपेरिमेंट्स की ऑब्जर्वेशंस के बेसिस पर थ्योरी बनाई, ऐसे किया? यस मैम, ठीक है। Whereas Hull goes the other way round. He first professes a theory or proposes a theory, and then he goes on to experimentally validate that theory. Okay? So basically what he does is that we'll do that, what is the hypothetico-deductive approach in detail, the steps of that, because you tend to get a 7.5 or a 2 marker on just hypothetico-deductive approach. ठीक है? So वो उसको पहले डिटेल में कराऊंगी और उसके बाद हल करेंगे। हल अगर पूरा क्वेश्चन आता है तब भी आपको ये लिखना है, अगर सिर्फ हाइपोथेटिकल डिडक्टिव अप्रोच पे आता है तो फिर उतना ही लिखना है शॉर्ट नोट के जैसा, ठीक है। नाउ उसमें बेसिकली क्या है दैट he does a lot of review about the construct that he is working on. Suppose he is working on learning, what does learning mean, तो उसकी पूरी definitions हर तरह से उसको define करो एक comprehensive तरीके से उस construct को, और फिर उसके basis पे कुछ laws या postulates बनाते हैं, और उन laws and postulates के basis पे he makes certain deductions which are called theorems. As I said, he brings in mathematics to psychology. You remember doing theorems in maths? Yes, ma'am. Okay. So his theorems are more like Euclid's geometry. Something like that. So he proposes certain theorems, and then he goes on to testify those theorems experimentally. Okay. So those theorems which actually get validated by an experimental approach or by an experiment, those become a part of the theory, and on that that theory stands. Otherwise he goes in for an amendment of the whole process. ठीक है? I hope it's clear. समझ आया? उल्टा जाते हैं, बजाय कि एक्सपेरिमेंट करके फिर थ्योरी बनाने के पहले थ्योरी बनाते हैं, फिर उसको एक्सपेरिमेंटली वैलिडेट करते हैं, ठीक है। So he makes certain deductions, he makes certain hypotheses, then makes certain deductions, and then testify those deductions, and hence postulates a theory or supports a theory with his experimental results. Okay? That's the main thing. Now besides that, when we talk about Hull's theory, he to begin with has proposed, this is the theoretical part, जो करेंगे hypothetical deductive approach. Coming on to the experimental part of his work, he proposes 16 postulates to begin with. Originally 16 postulates इन्होंने propose किए थे, उनको डिटेल में करेंगे, और फिर उसके बाद रिविजन में कुछ और postulates इन्होंने ऐड किए, ठीक है। So in a way majorly 2 sections में इस theory को करेंगे हम, ठीक है। Now to begin with, first let's talk about your hypothetical deductive approach. ये वाला जो पार्ट है ये प्लीज आप गोल्डमैन में से करिएगा, hypothetical deductive approach अगर खुद से पढ़ना है, वैसे मैं आपको काफी हद तक लिखवा रही हूँ, लेकिन फिर भी। Now being a behaviorist, he believes that everything that exists in nature is in quantifiable terms. That means they can be measured. Okay, and he has basically discerned 4 methods of discovering scientific truth. The first method is unplanned observation. He proposes 4 methods of discovering scientific truth. The first one is unplanned observation. The second is systematic planned observation. Third, fruitful to unravel the scientific truth. But he further proposes a 4th method. Which comes from intuition and or observation. Now the 4th method is the hypothetico-deductive method. This we'll do in detail. It is a 3-step method of research. Hypothetico-deductive approach or hypothetico-deductive method. applies rigorous deductions from a prior set principles. Rigorous deductions, deductive है ना, deductions from a prior set principles. So first a system of definitions has to be introduced. 3-step method है. First, a system of definitions has to be introduced. Then, second, a series of highly conceptualized postulates or
A series of
highly conceptualized postulates or tentatively stated laws is proposed.
tentatively
Stated laws is proposed. That's the second step. Third, from these postulates and definitions, a series of detailed theorems from these postulates and definitions, a series of detailed theorems is rigorously deduced the totality of definitions, postulates and theorems. They formulate a systematic and integrated theory. The totality of definitions, postulates and theorems form a systematic and integrated theory. So the fourth step is that this theory,
Can you repeat the point from the initial start?
this theory, the next step is that this theory should be tested by a carefully controlled experimentation. Any part of the theory, controlled experimentation, any part of the theory which does not pass the experimental test has to be modified according to the experimental evidence. Any part of the theory which does not pass the experimental test has to be modified according to the experimental evidence. ठीक है? So it's a 3-step method. First you make definitions. From definitions you make certain laws or principles which are the postulates. From these postulates you deduce certain theorems. Now these 3 things, your definitions, your postulates and theorems combined become a part of the theory or become a theory, and then he goes on to testify that theory experimentally. In case there is a problem realized during experiment or after experimentation that postulates ठीक नहीं थे तो उसको amend करिए, अगर आपको लगता है theorems ठीक नहीं थे तो उसको करिए, and so on and so forth, and make amendments. Otherwise the theory stands if it is experimentally validated. Now Hull has a strong emphasis on this approach because he feels that the advantage of this deductive method is that this kind of mathematical and formal logical statements, Hull proposes that the advantage of this deductive method is that this form of mathematical and formal logical statements,
This method
formal logical statements, mathematical and formal logical statements have unlimited generalization or generality, have unlimited generality. further proposes 4 criteria for a scientific theory. He proposed 4 criteria for a scientific theory. The first concerns the definitions and the postulates. The first criteria concerns the definitions and the postulates. So definitions and postulates have to be, according to this criteria, the definitions and the postulates have to be 1. Clearly defined. 2. Mutually consistent. That means they are not contradicting each other. 3. Formulated in a manner so as to permit deductions of theorems. Formulated in a manner so as to permit deductions of theorems. And 4th, they should be as few as possible. Few as possible. कम से कम होनी चाहिए. Definition किसी चीज की 1, 2, 5 होती है, 100 नहीं हो सकती है ना. ठीक है, बहुत ज़्यादा definition हो जाएंगे तो vague हो जाएगा, ambiguity हो जाएगी. तो आपके जो definitions और postulates हैं, first criteria उनसे related है, और वो कहते हैं कि जो आपकी definitions और postulates हैं वो एकदम clearly defined होने चाहिए, कम से कम होने चाहिए, consistent होने चाहिए, एक दूसरे को contradict ना करे definition या postulate definition को या definition एक दूसरे को, ठीक है. और चौथी चीज की इस तरह से stated होने चाहिए कि उनमें से theorems deduce कर सके, ठीक है. Now the second criterion, it concerns the implications and inferences to be deduced. The second criterion concerns the inferences and implications to be deduced from these definitions and postulates. So all deductions have to be clear. 1, they should be clear. 2, they should be exhibited, which means no hidden assumptions. And 3, they should be detailed. तो आपके जो theorems हैं, वो deductions हैं आपकी, और वो आपकी clear होनी चाहिए, उनमें कोई hidden implications नहीं होनी चाहिए, और तीसरी चीज वो detailed होना, ठीक है. Now the third and the fourth criteria, they deal with the relationship between the theorems and the experiment. They deal with the relationship between the theorems and the experiments. So theorems usually represent the anticipated outcomes of experimental studies. Theorems usually represent the anticipated outcomes of experimental studies. So according to the third criterion, theorems should be closely related. Theorems, according to the third criterion, theorems should be closely related to empirical data. Otherwise, there is no way of checking them experimentally. The theorem should be related to empirical data. Otherwise, there will be no way of checking them experimentally. criterion deals with experimental proof of the theory. Deals with experimental proof of the theory. Now, since Hull, I mentioned, has brought in mathematics to psychology, and in mathematics everything is quantified, everything is measurable, it has a unit. But then when you apply mathematics to a field like psychology, Hull acknowledged that this kind of strict quantification is not possible every time. That is why he had to mellow down to a more, what he calls it as a coarse-grained approach, dardada hota hai jaisa. So he mellowed down to a quasi-quantitative approach. But still he has proposed certain criterion for quantification which are relevant and which he says are important for psychology to be proven as a scientific discipline. Behaviorist का ये मानना था कि psychology is a pure science, है ना? अगर याद हो आपको वाटसन याद है, वो सब चीज़ को सेंसरी मोटर पे ले आए, हर चीज़ measurable है, हर चीज़ आपकी जो दिख रहा है ऑब्जर्वेबल है, मेजरेबल है, एक्सपेरिमेंटली वैलिडेट हो सकता है, वही साइकोलॉजी है और अदरवाइज नहीं है. ठीक है, यही था उनका टेक मेनली. सो उसी हिसाब से ही हैज ट्राइड टू क्वांटिफाई एवरीथिंग, बट देन ही goes on to even acknowledge a quasi quantitative approach. Quasi is partial, yes sir, you know, quantitative approach, but has proposed a three-step proposed three steps that leads to quantification. The first step is 3 steps for quantification. Really clear that he has, but still he has proposed 3 steps for quantification. First, one variable has to be stated. First step is one variable has to be stated as a mathematical function of at least one other variable. One variable has to be stated as a mathematical function of at least one other variable, usually in the form of an equation. Usually in the form of an equation. Second, at least one factor in the equation must be a constant. At least one factor in the equation must be constant. And third, if measurement has to take place, a unit of measurement should be available. If measurement has to take place, then the unit of measurement has to be available. कल हमने ल्यूविन की, अगर मैं इसमें आपको एक एग्जांपल दूं, तो हल हैज नॉट गिवन मी समथिंग लाइक दिस. दिस इज ल्यूविन्स इक्वेशन. यू ऑल नो दैट? यस मैम. ओके. नाउ हियर बिहेवियर इज अ फंक्शन ऑफ पर्सन एंड ठीक है. दैट्स योर फर्स्ट क्राइटेरियन फॉर क्वांटिफाई. और हमने जब कल किया, टॉलमन हैज ट्राइड टू क्वांटिफाई बिहेवियर इन टर्म्स ऑफ बिहेवियर रेशियो, मेजरेबल यूनिट्स में ले आए उसको. हम साइकोलॉजी में साइकोमेट्रिक्स के तहत क्या करते हैं? हम इमोशंस को, हैप्पीनेस को, सबको एक नंबर में लाते हैं, कोशिश करते हैं ना, क्वांटिफाई कर देते हैं, एक यूनिट ले लेते हैं. ठीक है, इतना स्कोर है तो इतना डिप्रेशन है, इतना स्कोर है तो इतना हैप्पीनेस है, इतना स्कोर है तो इतना साइकोपैथोलॉजी है, इतना नार्सिसिज्म है. हर चीज को क्वांटिफाई करने की कोशिश करते हैं ताकि हम एक प्योर साइंस की तरफ जाने की कोशिश करते हैं. लेकिन हमें फिर भी पता है कि हमारी साइंस में कभी भी फिजिक्स, केमिस्ट्री या मैथमेटिक्स जैसा 2 and 2 4 नहीं होगा, कभी भी नहीं होगा. इसलिए हम फिर एक क्वासी क्वांटिटेटिव अप्रोच के तहत 0.01 या 0.05 लेवल का हम एरर का स्कोप छोड़ देते हैं. छोड़ते हैं, ये करते हैं. ठीक है. सो अगर आप इसमें देखें, तीनों ये जो आपके 3 स्टेप्स हैं या 3 क्राइटेरिया फॉर क्वांटिफिकेशन है वो लागू होते हैं और आपके पास यूनिट्स है इनको सबको मेजर करने की पर्सनालिटी यू कैन मेजर यू हैव यूनिट्स एनवायरमेंटल क्या इन्फ्लुएंसेस है स्टिमुलस कितना देना है इंटेंसिटी आप वो सब मेजर कर सकते हैं कल किया हमने टॉलमन में इंडिपेंडेंट वेरिएबल्स में हर चीज़ को हम एक्सपेरिमेंटल और एनवायरमेंटल वेरिएबल्स को क्वांटिफाई कर सकते हैं इसको क्वांटिफाई कर सकते हैं ठीक है और ये जो है ये आपका कांस्टेंट रहता है f is a constant in this isn't it like a mathematical equation like in your equation of gravity g is the constant ठीक है so you always have a constant according to height in the equation I hope it's okay that's all about hypothetical deductive approach okay now Hallman proposes his theory he acknowledges that human behavior ये थोड़ा सा लिख लीजिए human behavior is an interplay between the organism and the environment यही है ना human behavior is an interplay between the organism and the environment where it is an interaction of the stimulus which is provided from the environment and the response is given by the organism SR in this the interaction of the stimulus that is provided by the environment and the response is given by the organism interplay है ना S और R का now these two facts are observable but the totality of the interaction must be viewed in a broader context which is not entirely observable. I repeat, but the totality of the interaction must be viewed in some broader context which is not entirely an observable stimulus response situation. Stimulus response situation. हम कहते हैं कि behavior is an interaction basically S और R है बिहेवियरिस्ट की एक रिडक्शनिस्ट अप्रोच है
yes,
याद है वॉटसन और वो सब जब किया था बिहेवियरिज्म के बेसिक पोस्टुलेट्स किए थे हमने कहा था कि बिहेवियरिज्म एक रिडक्शनिस्ट अप्रोच है जहां पर वो बिहेवियर को रिड्यूस करके एक इररिड्यूसिबल एसआर यूनिट पे ले आते हैं दैट्स अ रिफ्लेक्स
yes,
स्टिमुलस आया रिस्पांस आया इट्स एन ऑटोमेटाइज्ड मैकेनिस्टिक रिफ्लेक्स which means that there is no stimulus without a response and there is no response which does not have a stimulus अगर आपको ये याद हो हमने बेसिक पोस्टुलेट्स में किया था
yes.
to predict a response from a stimulus and to post-predict a stimulus from a response ठीक है so बहुत क्लियर है बिहेवियरिज्म में कि अगर S है तो पक्का R आएगा और अगर R आ रहा है तो पक्का अंडरलाइन कोई S होगा ठीक है but now here he says that he goes further and he says SR तो है लेकिन जब आप बिहेवियर को स्टडी करेंगे तो इट इज नॉट अ सिंपल इंटरैक्शन बट यू हैव टू टेक द टोटलिटी ऑफ द सिचुएशन इनटू कंसीडरेशन नाउ ही फर्दर सेज which gives his theory another name his theory is also known as not only hypothetical deductive approach but it is also known as mean reduction theory or it is also called drive reduction theory तो अगर क्वेश्चन में आएगा ड्राइव रिडक्शन थ्योरी ऑफ लर्निंग तो आपको पता होना चाहिए कि हल लिखना है हाइपोथेटिकल डिडक्टिव अप्रोच टू लर्निंग तो हल लिखना है मीन रिडक्शन थ्योरी आएगा तो भी हल लिखना है ठीक है ये सब नाम है अब अगर वो कहते हैं कि ब्रॉडर फ्रेम ऑफ रेफरेंस में बिहेवियर को या एसआर यूनिट को पढ़ना है तो उसके तहत ही सेज दैट what is a broader frame of reference? A broader frame of reference is biological adaptation. Why a stimulus has to be responded by an organism? Because the stimulus creates a kind of, or what is stimulating is always bringing along a state of disequilibrium. ये हम बार बार पहले भी कर चुके. जब भी कहीं, और जो कि शायद पावलोव भी कहीं कहते हैं अपनी थेरी में, कि अगर आपको याद हो हमने किया था कि जो फिजिकल एनर्जी एनवायरनमेंट में है वही फिजिकल एनर्जी एक ऑर्गेनिज्म के अंदर भी है. याद है किया था? सो जब भी आपका एनवायरनमेंट और ऑर्गेनिज्म के बीच में फ्लो ऑफ एनर्जी में डिसइक्विलिब्रियम आएगा, that puts the organism in a state of need, creates a state of disequilibrium, so there emerges a state of need, or we may say that the organism is in a is in a drive to restore equilibrium. ठीक है? And eventually the organism makes an adaptive act. ठीक है?
Yes.
It makes an adaptive act, or what we know as a response to restore equilibrium. Now, if that adaptive act is appropriate and addresses your underlying need and the drive state, equilibrium is restored.
Yes.
But in case it does not get restored, equilibrium अगर वापस से restore नहीं हुआ, that means the state of disequilibrium is still prevailing, and the organism will keep on indulging into other kind of adaptive acts to restore equilibrium. कुछ ना कुछ और options try करता रहता है जब तक कि equilibrium restore नहीं होता. So the ultimate goal is equilibration, or the ultimate goal is to restore equilibrium or attain a state of quiescence, or if I may say, the ultimate goal is need reduction or drive reduction. ठीक है? सेम ही चीज है ना? जब need reduce हो जाएगी, equilibrium restore हो जाएगा, और फिर हम कहते हैं कि organism has adapted to the environmental stimulus. Simple है? क्लियर है?
Yes.
कुछ डाउट इसमें? ये बहुत सरल भाषा में है. And the broader frame of reference is nothing but biological adaptation. And biological adaptation, it facilitates survival of the organism. So whenever the survival of the organism is not facilitated, the organism is in a state of need. The broader frame of reference is biological adaptation, which facilitates survival of the organism. And the survival of the organism, if not facilitated, then the organism is in a state of need. सही है? Now what is need? I defines need as a state of the organism in which a deviation of the organism from the optimum of a state of the organism in which a deviation of the organism को O डालते जाओ, जल्दी जल्दी लिखो, in which a deviation of the organism from the optimum of biological conditions necessary for survival take place. ठीक है? जो भी आपके सर्वाइवल के लिए ऑप्टिमल कंडीशन है, जब उससे डिविएशन होगी हम कहेंगे कि स्टेट ऑफ नीड है. ठीक? So when a need arises, the organism acts, and this action brings reduction in need. Whenever a need arises, the organism acts, and this action brings in reduction of need. So any behavior is 1. Goal directed, 2. The goal is reduction of need, which serves the promotion of optimal conditions for survival. Which serves the promotion of optimal means for survival. ठीक है जी? Done है? Now second thing, he defines drive. D, drive. Drive is a general condition of privation it is a general condition of privation. Privation is a word coming from deprivation. It is a general condition of privation in the organism. It is a common denominator. It is a common denominator of all primary motivations. Common denominator of all primary motivations, that is, could be food privation, could be sex privation, water privation, कुछ भी प्राइमरी जो भी आपकी मोटिव्स हैं उनके अंडरलाइन जो एक फोर्स है दैट इज अ ड्राइव. Now, under the presence of needs and drives, organism takes adaptive action, and the pattern of action under the pressure of needs and drives, the organism takes adaptive action. The pattern of action which leads to reduction in need and drive becomes predominant or is reinforced. Predominant or reinforced. अब आपने कुछ नीड स्टेट है और उसमें कुछ एडेप्टिव एक्शन किया जिससे नीड रिडक्शन नहीं हुआ, तो फिर अगली बार वो वाला ऐसा कनेक्शन जो है वो स्ट्रेंथन होगा? नहीं होगा ना. नीड रिडक्शन जब तक नहीं होता तो दैट इज व्हाई एक्शन एप्रोप्रिएट नहीं है, तो अगली बार उसकी टेंडेंसी कम होती चली जाएगी. और आपने कुछ ऐसा किया जिससे नीड एड्रेस हो गई, तो अगली बार वो एस आर जो लिंक बना वो स्ट्रेंथन हो जाएगा. अगले फ्यूचर में